Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of Cover One Buffalo. I'm your host, Aaron Quinn, back from vacation. I missed you guys last week, but Nate and Eric held it down. Back here with Nate and Brad Kelly. What's going on, guys?
Living the dream.
Yeah.
Nothing much. Just, same thing, living the dream, getting ready for the summertime.
Yeah. So Brad, if you guys aren't familiar with Brad, he joins us from the Cover One podcast. They break down all the draft guys. So their work is just starting up for next year's class, I believe. They did a great job this draft season. And Brad did a great breakdown, wide receiver breakdown that you could purchase by. I did it. It was awesome. Great breakdown. So here we're bringing him on because today we're talking about the most talked about position group on the offense on Twitter right now is the wide receiver group. Nobody's happy about it. So welcome, Brad. What else do you have going on, man, with the Cover One podcast?
Oh, yeah. So we do the Cover One, the NFL Draft podcast, me and Russell Brown. We were trying to record last night, but Russell was putting together a TV stand that he said was 30 steps and took him like the entire day. So we didn't get to last night, but we'll be doing that sometime this week probably. And as far as writing for Cover One, I'm working on a series of articles highlighting the top receiver groups throughout college football. So far, we've done Ole Miss and South Carolina, Ole Miss and Alabama. Working on South Carolina. We'll probably look at other teams like Miami. Probably get to Arizona State with N'Keal Harry out there too. So really, it's going to go through the probably the top 10 receiver groups throughout college football. Just looking ahead to the season.
Awesome. It's great work that you guys do over there. And if you enjoy just the Bills, it's a great resource to get ramped up for the draft, because as Nate and I have kind of pointed out that it might be another important draft, picking in the top 10, probably good chance of that next year. So you might want to pay attention to that. And wide receiver position being one of need, you might want to pay attention and go give Brad a follow if you're going to be interested in that class. I know one guy that's going to be interested in that Miami write-up, and it's our new contributor, Rob Quinn, big Miami fan. So you might have to hit him up when you drop that Miami write-up and let him know what you think of his boys. But before we get into it tonight, ripping into the wide receiver group, I just wanted to mention that we do have the Cover One app. Go download that, iOS, Android, get it no matter where you are, sitting on your lunch break, actually just on the clock working. I don't care if you're on the clock reading Cover One stuff. You can get it right on your phone. Your boss won't even know. You'll just be on your phone like everyone else is anyway. And you get the push notification. So anytime Brad writes something or anybody, Nate's dropping some hot stuff, whenever that stuff's coming out, the hot takes all over the place. It'll come right to you, pop-up notification. You can't really beat it. It's free. So go get that and support the Cover One team. As always, you can follow us on all your social medias, find us on all the podcast networks, all that. So let's just jump right into it because everybody wants to talk about the wide receiver.
We're not going to pour one out for Jerry Sullivan right now.
We can pour one out for Jerry, man. That's your boy if you want to.
Let's pour one out for Jerry. I don't have any OE. That's the only thing that would really
I'll drink
do
one.
Jerry. That'd be the only thing really worthy to pour out for Jerry. But RIP.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff happening in the Buffalo news climate, but I think everybody will still have a voice at the end of the day. So I don't expect to see Jerry go away anytime soon.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's very true.
It's like almost like a cockroach, like myself.
Right.
Yeah. You might be able to block me, but I'm still going to get.
You will never die. You'll never fully die, no matter how much you just want to,
crumble me up.
Right. Yeah.
So wide receiver group. It wasn't a great group last season, and with the lack of ability of Tyrod to really get the ball, and he wanted to play safe too many times, right? So that also hurt a mediocre wide receiver group. We come into this year, we don't know who the quarterback's going to be. We're assuming probably McCarron, unless Allen can win that job. One of those two guys still has an issue of being a weak wide receiver group on paper, right? So Nate, I know you are really down on this group. Let's get right into it, man. The starters, the top heavy. What do you think of those guys at least?
My wide receiver one, Jeremy Curley, very into. Actually, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of like to pick up a Curley. He'll be their number 3 receiver. He'll be their slot receiver. He'll play. But in terms of the depth, even up top, they boast like maybe one top 35 receiver, right? Mm-hmm. Other than that, they've got really nothing. I don't know where Zay Jones stands. I mean, with injuries, it's been sort of a tough offseason for a guy who had a tough season. You'd love for him to get a full participation during the offseason program, workouts, and then obviously just the install. That's really important stuff to be be there for and sort of be going with emotions for. So it's unfortunate for him. We'll see what happens with his development. Obviously a really disappointing rookie campaign, but there are a lot of factors that can lead to, to a bounce back season for Zay Jones. And I don't know. We'll see. It's going to be about whether or not Zay Jones can regain that confidence that he sort of lost at times last year. So, but obviously Kelvin Benjamin's the number one wide receiver, and we're going to find out whether or not he can still be that.
We got some feedback coming from you, Brad. If you can shut off the YouTube feed there or something, or mute. Sorry about that.
I'm not playing anything.
Okay, word. So we had some feedback. I don't know what's going on with that, guys, if you're experiencing that. Brad, what do you think of the top of the wide receiver group for the Bills?
Yeah, so I think Nate hit it pretty well on the head about Kelvin Benjamin definitely being the number one receiver. And even in him being the number one receiver, I don't necessarily know if he is a traditional, number one top flight type of guy. He's a guy who he has the athleticism, he has the upside, but he's always had some limitations as a pass catcher. And part of that was, injuries during his developmental stages, in his second year. But he's never been a guy who can consistently win, despite his size, despite his athleticism. He's always left a little bit to be desired. And I think Nate said it, a top 35 receiver sounds about right for him. He's in that probably in the 25 to 35 range. He's not a guy who's matchup proof. He's not a guy who week in and week out you can count on to really be able to go out and get 5-6 catches a game and 75 to 100 yards. Then looking past him, there's not that much there. There's a lot of guys, but I don't know if there's a lot. This is an incomplete pass, by the way. I just want to throw it out there.
No, come on.
Against the Patriots. No, come on. But there are a lot of guys, but I don't know if there's a lot of quality guys. We touched on Zay Jones and Jeremy Curley. Those are probably number 2 and 3. You're looking for Zay Jones to progress from his rookie year. He had a lot of targets, but he was kind of rough around the edges. I think that was to be expected coming out in his rookie season. Then Jeremy Curley's been around for a while. He's been okay as a number 3 receiver. That's a decent role for him. And then they have some young guys who have some upside. 3 guys that are going to be rookies, and Ray McLeod, Robert Foster, and Cam Phillips. They're all kind of late round undrafted free agent types. Maybe one of them can pan out. Maybe one of them can become a producer. Kind of like probably really in a competition for a roster spot between the 3 of them. And whoever can come out on top might be able to produce, but that's kind of just a wild card at this point.
Sure. Here's where I'm going to get a little bit more optimistic than maybe you have been, Nate. And I think both you guys bring a very pragmatic view to this wide receiver group. And I'm going to give a little bit of the fan in me because I like Kelvin Benjamin a lot. I do agree that he's maybe in that top 35. I don't know that he's a very good wide receiver as far as other teams go. But I think you brought it up, Nate, last year about, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said he's got that Gronk ability in the red zone. He's not a Gronk. I'm not saying that he is, but he's got that ability. And I think, say, Josh Allen is the quarterback with his accuracy issues, to have a guy that has that large of a catch radius that the ball doesn't need to be completely accurate for him to go up and get it. I think that's a huge benefit. So I think that could actually make Benjamin a little bit better than he was last year with the Bills, especially if he comes in healthy. So I don't mind that number 1.
I guess it'll be interesting who is playing quarterback, because I think that'll make more of an easier projection of what you're going to get from Kelvin Benjamin. I think Kelvin Benjamin would really probably benefit from a guy like Josh Allen, who's going to be more of a willing passer, a guy who's going to throw it up on the run across his body at times and make some plays. But if it's going to be a guy like A.J. McCarron and Nathan Peterman, which I guess I didn't give enough of a percentage chance to Nathan Peterman to start, because it seems like he's getting a legitimate shot and legitimate looks here in the OTAs as the number 1 or with the number 1 offense. So it'll be interesting, because I don't know that he's a rhythm and timing sort of offense wide receiver. He's more of outside the scope of a normal offense, how a normal offense operates. He's not really a great route runner. He's not like a super precise guy, which, I didn't think he really fit into the West Coast scheme very well at all, because he just didn't have the ability to get a lot of yards after catch. He's a big guy. Like you mentioned, the Gronk factor. I did say that last year. And one of the reasons why is he just presents matchup nightmares to normal size defenders over the middle of the field, between the hashes. But I think where he's maybe the most dangerous and hopefully they could take advantage of this more this year, is between the hash marks and numbers, sort of that dead area and a lot of zone defenses up the middle of the field. And I think that's where he needs to thrive. And then you'd have a quarterback willing to do it over the middle. And even though at times, Tyrod got the bad rap for maybe an unwillingness to throw over the middle, for me, he did, but it was more of dump offs. It was more of that kind of play instead of those true seam routes or those routes in between the hash mark and the numbers where you can really start to take advantage of those one high safety defenses.
Yeah. And so I think that's fine at number one. And we're not expecting this offense. I'm not saying that this is going to be a good wide receiver core. I'm not expecting this offense to do a lot, but I do think that they can be better than they were a year ago if this core that you're talking about, this Benjamin Jones, Curley, stays intact. And a guy that I didn't get really either of your opinions on is Rod Streeter. I think that if he can come in and play the way he did in training camp last year and maybe go on top of that a little bit and continue to get better, I think that could be a huge lift to have a fourth, still mediocre receiver, but good enough threat for a guy that can then come in and make some plays. Brad, what are your thoughts on that, man?
I liked Rod Streeter when he was young. He's kind of bounced around the league a long time, multiple different teams throughout the years and never really been able to stick for a long period of time. So I think that he realistically is he's another guy who's in a competition for a roster spot, probably with Holmes and Malachi Dupree. I think that between the three of them, you're probably looking at whoever wins that competition be the fourth receiver on the roster. And they're all guys who have decent size who can run, but I don't know if you're going to get much out of Rod Streeter. I think that more likely than not, it's going to be Holmes' job to lose. And he'd probably be more of your number 4 option, going forward.
And do you think that's just because of special teams alone, or do you think he's a better wide receiver than Rod Streeter?
I think he's shown that he's a better wide receiver than Rod Streeter throughout his career too. Even when he was with the Raiders, he got more looks than Streeter throughout his time there. And I think obviously the special teams could help, but I think Holmes with his frame, his potential is always going to be higher than Streeter at 6'4". He's like 215, right?
Yeah.
So he's a guy that he's shown the ability to thrive in the red zone as well in his career, and I think that he's probably more of a prototypical number 4, especially because if you think about it, if Kelvin Benjamin to be opposite Kelvin Benjamin, another guy who's a big body, a big target, I think Holmes is going to be your guy.
Bills fans aren't going to love hearing that from me, my man. Now, out of you had mentioned there a little bit that Malachi Dupree might be in that competition. Nate, do you think Malachi Dupree can be competing in that group, or do you think he's still competing with Brandon Riley to be on that practice squad final guy bubble? Where do you think he is? Because I see the talent when I look up the videos, but it hasn't translated to getting him past practice squad. So what do you think there, man?
It'll be interesting. I think really 4, 5, and 6, if they decide to keep 6 receivers, I don't know, because I think they might decide to keep 4 running backs, and it'll sort of be, and obviously 3 tight ends, 4 tight ends. So they've got a lot of position, who they're going to dress on game day. So it'll be interesting to see who ends up making the roster, but it's all going to be about special teams versatility. You and I both know that. I mean, that's really what's going to make the difference for whether or not you're going to make the roster. And Brad talked about size, and Dupree's a guy who's got some nice size, who can at least give you some of a speed element. At the end of the day, you start to look back, and even some of the best offenses against some of the best quarterbacks. The year, 2 years ago, Green Bay comes to mind, where, they lose Jordy Nelson, they lose that deep threat, and teams just buckled down and played man-to-man and forced those receivers who were really more like slot guys that couldn't really break man coverage or beat teams deep. Teams really started to take advantage of that. And I could see a similar situation playing out this year, where if they don't have a quarterback who's willing to throw the ball up, and Dupree's a guy that you could just see right there that can go get the football and go high point the ball. And if that's going to be a theme, and they're going to need guys to go do that, they're going to have a willing passer. So that's why I think it really is all going to be dependent on who is playing quarterback on maybe these guys towards the bottom of the roster. I don't know if Dupree can bring a special teams element. He's not really a return guy. I think he's been practicing as a punt returner during OTAs, but he hasn't really been a guy that you've seen historically that's going to likely give you a big special teams threat. So he's got to make the team as the number 4, because your number 5 wide receiver is really going to be a special teams kind of guy. So I don't know. The way the bottom of this wide receiver roster breaks out will be really interesting to sort of follow throughout the offseason. But it's going to be interesting because there's still guys available. Is Zay Jones going to be, ready come training camp? Because if he's not, I think this team needs to really explore how they can add someone, whether that's Jeremy Maclin. And I know, after last season of more injuries, is he really even should be consideration? I don't know, maybe, but they need some sort of speed added to this wide receiver group because I think teams are just going to bear down on them.
Sure. Now, Brad, giving your non-Bills opinion on this as an outsider looking in, because when I'm on Twitter, I'm hearing all the time about Brandon Riley and Malachi Dupree as guys that may be able to step up. But I take that with a little bit of a grain of salt because us Bills fans tend to way overhype practice squad guys, guys that perform well in the preseason, things like that. Do either of those guys, Dupree or Riley, seem to you to be a guy that at a young age can come in and be even a mediocre wide receiver at the NFL level? What are your thoughts on that, man? At the NFL level, what are your thoughts on that, man?
I think of the two of them, I would bet on Malachi Dupree. We're still showing the highlights on the video, and he is a guy like Nate touched on that can go get the ball. He's another guy with good size. I think he's like around 6'2", 200, and he has good body control. He showed that at LSU, and LSU is historically bad at developing their receivers. Despite having all this NFL talent, they're bad at developing them. They're bad at giving them the football. They haven't had a good quarterback and God knows how long, being able to get them the ball and help them develop. And I think that having a year on the practice squad in Buffalo and then, maybe another a full off season in Buffalo as well, going through all the OTAs and the mini camps and training camps could be what Dupree needs to really get to that next level. He has the athleticism. He showed that at the combine. So he's a guy who, I would bet on him of the two. I think that there's potential there to be a bottom of the roster, a small contributor, number 4 receiver. But as far as projecting him for anything more than that, I don't think that's realistic.
Interesting. And now, Nate, before we got on here, there was a guy that you said that you may or may not be an advocate of, to the point where maybe you have a burner account for him.
That and, I decided, I do this every once in a while where I go on a Madden kick. And, I did a season with whoever updated the rosters with, Josh Allen and all those guys and all the rookies in the rookie class. And Austin Proehl, man, he's my number 3. He's my slot. I got him going. I cheated and I boosted him, gave him some good ratings. But no, Austin Proehl's an interesting guy because a great career at North Carolina. If you remember 2 years ago, they had quite a nice team, a nice offense with him and Ryan Switzer. Switzer obviously just got traded this offseason to Oakland, who I think is going to use him way more than Dallas did last year. And Proehl was sort of the second thought to Switzer that season. But this year, his senior year, obviously they took a step back at the quarterback position. A young guy at North Carolina, so he didn't have as much game-breaking plays, but he was a guy on the outside, just sort of a steady hand. Obviously his dad is the former wide receiver for, I think, Carolina for a long time, Ricky Proehl. So yeah, he's an interesting guy because I love just my small white receivers. He's not super small, but I'm a big fan of Proehl's, and I'm hoping that he can find his way onto the roster, whether that be returning kicks or however he's got to make the roster. He's not a dynamic athlete, but he's certainly an NFL caliber athlete.
Sure. And I was talking to a guy that does a lot of draft coverage for the Chicago Bears, and when he was looking at Trubisky, 2 years ago, he said Proehl kept popping up to him then, and he really liked him and was hoping the Bears might take him, but they were so deep at skill positions that he could see why they didn't after taking Miller in this draft. But Brad, when you were running down the wide receivers here this past class, this was a name that popped up to me that I was surprised that the Bills were able to draft him that late, especially with some of the guys that were kind of lingering around late just because of his campaign 2 years ago.
I'm surprised Bill Belichick didn't draft him, to be honest.
Well, we'll ask Brad about it. Brad, what are your thoughts on that? And what you saw out of him in his last year in college?
So I had, if I'm being honest here, I had, I think, 32 draftable grades and another 15 that I thought would be priority free agents, and Austin Proehl didn't make either of those lists. Looking at him with Trubisky, I thought that, watching Trubisky film, I should say, I always thought that he was second fiddle to Ryan Switzer. And then looking at him this past year with the injury that he had during the season, he only played about half the season, I think. And the fact that he's only been in the end zone like 4 or 5 times in his college career, I had a brief glance at him and then didn't really look too much past him. So I was actually surprised when he was picked up. I thought that I probably should have paid more paid him a little more mind, I guess, when I was scouting all the receivers. As far as the Belichick thing goes, I could see why you would say that. But they got our guy Berrios, so I guess that counteracts the need for a guy like Austin Proehl.
And so with that, Brad, what do you think of the other draft pick at wide receiver? Because I think that one caught a lot of people by surprise, and Ray McCloud going there there were some good, or at least decent wide receivers on the board still, maybe guys that weren't draftable. But for McCloud to go there, even ahead of Proehl, I think that maybe Proehl might be a better actual wide receiver than McCloud, but McCloud has more special teams ability. What did you see from McCloud, or did you even scout him as a wide receiver because he didn't have that many touches?
I did scout him as a wide receiver. I had a draftable grade on Ray McCloud. I think that he's a guy who his best football is ahead of him. He was always kind of in a timeshare, even in this past season at Clemson, with Deion Kane, who was drafted, and with Hunter Renfrow, who should be drafted next year. He's been around, feels like been around forever. But he's a guy who, in that scenario, and with the more of a runner at QB, not a guy who's a great passer like the year before with Watson, that it was definitely hard for him to get touches. But I think the talent was there, and the talent was always there when looking at Clemson, over the last couple of years. So I think he is a guy who his best football will be ahead of him. He's a good athlete. I know he's a little bit undersized, and he was a little bit underwhelming in his 40 time. I think people thought he was more of a 4.4 guy. But I do think overall that he seems athletic on film. Definitely NFL type of athleticism, and I thought that he would be a guy who could get drafted, and he ultimately was, I believe, in the 6th round.
And now, Nate, between those two guys that were drafted guys, like you said, a bunch of these guys aren't going to make the 53. Do you think that you will be able to tuck both or either of these guys into the practice squad if neither of them make the team coming out of this training camp? But what are your thoughts there? I mean, are we going to be able to hide guys this year or what?
I think McCloud is a great opportunity to make this roster because as your 5th receiver, for a lot of reasons, I don't know that Proehl is going to offer that same security for me. I think Proehl is a really, really good practice squad idea, and he may be in the practice squad ahead of a guy like Brandon Riley this year because they make a priority because he was drafted. But Ray McCloud's a guy I think that this year could make an impact because I think he can return kicks for this team. They don't really have that guy, Brandon Tate, obviously moving on this year. They don't have necessarily a go-to kicker punt returner. So I think McCloud, who had a really nice career as both of those things at Clemson, can provide that sort of steady hand. He could probably play. Now I don't know for sure, but I mean, just based on his knowledge of special teams, I believe he could probably cover kicks as well. And I think that'll make him really valuable and a potential part of the bottom of this roster. Can he play receiver? I don't know. But I'll tell you that I think he fills a really, really interesting need this team, I thought, really needed since they tried to bring Percy Harvin in, but he ended up playing more receiver. They need a gadget-type player. They need a guy that can run some jet sweep. That's going to be Ray McCloud. They need a guy that can play over the middle of the field. He's not going to be a guy that's going to be able to provide you as an outside threat running the route tree. That's just asking him to do that, I think, would be putting him in a difficult situation, especially early in his career. Like Brad said, I think he's got his best football ahead of him, but I think putting him in the best situations, like inside the slot, coming out of the backfield as a running back threat on 3rd down as a pass catcher, like those are situations I could see Ray McCloud making an impact. But I think most of all, it's going to be special teams, and I think that's what could potentially see him landing on the team. I don't think you spend a 6th round pick on a guy and with the idea that you're going to spend two picks down on your practice squad. I think that Ray McCloud, as long as he shows capable during training camp and during the preseason, he's going to get a really good look at that 5th or 6th spot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the more I hear you talk about him and other people talk about him, I do agree that, the special teams might just rise him up and put him in that slot as far as where he can shake out on the 53. Now, Brad, as a guy that looked through, really spotlighted wide receivers in this draft, there's a couple names that popped up for the undrafted priority free agents for the Bills here. We got Robert Foster, Cam Phillips. What can Bills fans expect out of guys like that coming into training camp this year? Can either of these guys kind of find a spot and be one of those camp surprises, or are these guys just kind of bodies that are out there for training camp, and if they can find their way on a practice squad, they do, but don't expect much out of them?
So Robert Foster is super interesting because I really want to talk about him because it's like a curious case of Robert Foster type of thing. So he came into Alabama as the #1 wide receiver recruit in the country. He was a top 25 recruit consensus across all the recruiting services, higher than I can't remember who was higher than, but he was #1. He gets to Alabama, and there are these like urban legends of him in Alabama practices, absolutely torching All-American defensive backs, like all the All-American defensive backs throughout his time that he faced at Alabama, that none of them could cover him in practice. But that he had some issues with getting on the field. There were obviously a ton of talent ahead of him, Amari Cooper and then Calvin Ridley. And then they always had a quarterback who was not much of a thrower throughout his years. Additionally, when it came to the game, I guess it wasn't always really there for him. So he's a guy who came into the league with almost no college production, but a guy who is well known as a talent. And obviously I think he deserves to be at NFL camp because of that talent. If you look at his athleticism, he has decent size. He's about 6'2", close to 200 pounds, and he runs a 4.41 40, which is it's over the 80th percentile for a receiver. So he has all the ability in the world. He has the size and the athleticism. It's just a matter of putting everything together on game day for him. But as far as his projection goes in year one, it's probably more of a practice squad. It's probably still that developmental role. But I think that looking forward, he is a guy who could become a producer and another guy who the best football is ahead of him. And I think that he's a super interesting prospect because of that. When it comes to Cam Phillips, he's more of a slot receiver, kind of similar. He played a little bit on the outside, but he projects as more of a slot receiver, kind of similar to Austin Proehl in that sense, a little bit kind of like Zay Jones was in college. Phillips is a good route runner, but I think he's limited athletically. I think he benefited from being really the only receiver or talent that Virginia Tech had. I think that I had him as an undrafted guy as well, and I think that he's a guy who's probably more suited for the practice squad. Maybe he can become a piece later on, but I think that he's more of a long shot projection than Foster or McLeod are.
Do you think that any of these guys we're talking about when we're talking about pre-Riley, Phillips, Foster, they're not going to be able to tuck them all on the practice squad? Are other teams going to be looking at these guys if they get cut? Or the Bills going to be able to have their pick of the litter here?
I think that if a guy like Robert Foster gets sent to the practice squad, another team would be all over him because of those stories of him beating all the defensive backs, and because of that talent that he once had, that he has, to be that #1 receiver recruit in the country and to be that highly touted prospect throughout his time at Alabama, even if it didn't result in production. I think that teams will see that and will want that at least on their practice squad or maybe on their 53-man roster if they have an open spot, if there's an injury on someone else's roster or something like that.
Sure. And now, Nate, I don't know if you were watching some of those highlights there of Foster while we had him up. The thing that stands out to me for him is, one, Dable obviously went to the Bills and said, during their priority free agents period, hey, this guy's there, let's get him in. He saw what Brad was talking about at practice, so he saw it firsthand and said, what, this guy's at least worth bringing in here. But I saw a lot of jet sweep stuff, and you mentioned it here before earlier that Bills don't have that kind of guy. Do you think that is all comes together and said, hey, I know that this guy can run those, I know he's got the speed, and I think that he can be possibly more. Let's get him in here and try see if we can find that guy that he would like in his offense?
I guess my question would be, can he return kicks? Can he be a special teams contributor? Because that's the only opportunity he's going to have this year of beating a guy like River McLeod, who I don't know that we know can play special teams, but I think the coaching staff feels confident. I think his college tape suggests he can. You don't necessarily get that same feel from Foster. So that's what makes him more of an interesting projection here. But, Brad sort of alluded to it too. This is a guy with that top end speed, that 80 percentile speed, that 4.41. That's probably the fastest guy on this roster. So can they find a spot for him? Can they figure out a role for him? Can they carve one out for him? Because if they can, I think they can find room for that kind of speed. It's just going to be whether or not he can function within the kind of offense that Brian Dable wants to run at the NFL level. Is he a guy that can be a consistent guy? Can he be counted on the field? Can he make catches, not drop the ball? So these are all things that, you didn't necessarily see over the course of his college career, but you see a lot of cases about that, especially at the wide receiver position. Smaller level guys, the Adam Thielens of the world, the Stephon Diggs of the world, guys guys that aren't necessarily highly touted, but kind of come out of nowhere. It's a position. It's quirky like that. Same with the running back position, where you can get guys that sort of don't have the production in college. That there's a lot of factors surrounding that, and that's the one thing about evaluating wide receiver that makes it so hard on Brad, I'm sure, is that there's a lot of variables that aren't in their control. The quarterback play being one of them. And I can tell you, Foster didn't have a lot of consistent throwing over the course of his entire career there in Alabama. And you look at guys, and it's like the one guy that maybe was a consistent thrower is the guy that comes in the second half of the national championship game. So yeah, I don't know. He's a tough guy to really evaluate, but again, you can't coach speed, and can he get coached on the other things? That's going to be the question.
Sure. Now, guys, in the chat box here, don't forget to get any of your questions in here, because we're going to go through a couple more questions here and start to wrap it up. So if you have any questions, we'll take them, and for Brad or Nate or even myself here when it comes to the wide receivers. Brad, really the last thing I want to talk to you about here tonight is, so we've run through a bunch of the guys. We didn't really get to Kalen Clay or Quan Bray, but I think those guys are really just kind of taking up space on the roster with some guys that have more upside that do the same type of things that they do. So I'm not really considering those guys too much as far as the conversation here goes. But if you had to pick 5 guys that are going to be on the 53-man roster for the Bills this year, and we've kind of talked about it, but give me your 5 Bills wide receivers going into this season. Oh, you there?
I think you got him muted.
No, he's not showing up muted, so I don't know what. You there, bud?
You guys got me?
Yep. All right.
Yeah. I think if that was to pick 5, assuming Zay Jones is healthy, that it would be Kelvin Benjamin, Zay Jones, Jeremy Curley, Andre Holmes, and then Ray McLeod as that 5th receiver / special teamer, as we've alluded to. The way that Nate was describing the role that he projects McLeod in kind of reminded me of Lucky Whitehead when he was with the Cowboys a couple years ago as the guy who's a returner, 5th receiver when you really want to spread him out, go spread, and then a guy who can run some jet sweeps, that type of role. So I think that those 5 are the most likely. If Zay Jones' health is in question, I think that could open up the door for a guy like Robert Foster or Malachi Dupree. But I think that looking into camp, those 5 are probably the most likely.
Interesting. Nate, what do you think about that? Do you have any variance off of what he's saying, or do you think it's pretty cut and dry that's a 5 going into it, and that's what it's going to be?
Yeah, I think it'll come down to Streeter and Holmes. I would think that, Andre Holmes just did not impress in training camp last year. I think Rod Streeter was outperforming him until his injury. I think his roster spot was in serious jeopardy. Andre Holmes, this is before the Streeter's injury. And then they just, I don't know. I don't love the idea of Holmes. I would love if somebody could step up. They've put themselves in not a terrible spot. I mean, you could probably argue they have the worst talent at wide receiver, but when you're talking about guys from 4 to 6, they've got a ton. They've given themselves a lot of room for error. There's a lot of guys vying for those 2 positions. Competition tends to get the best out of a mid-level player. So we'll see what we can get out of Quan Bray, a guy that we didn't really talk about. Maybe Kalen Clay, who hasn't really yet stuck on an NFL roster for a full season. Maybe he can provide that. Maybe he's the special teams guy. Maybe he can return kicks. He did last year at times when he was on the Bills roster before they moved on from him. So we'll see. It's going to be about the competition that brings at the bottom of this roster who ends up making it. But I would think you got Kelvin, Curley, Jones. I'm going to give Rod Streeter the benefit of the doubt over Holmes because I thought he played really well in training camp. If he can bring that again this year, I think he'd have an opportunity to beat him. I think Ray McLeod sticks, and I think maybe one other guy. Like I said, though, it's going to be interesting about what they decide to do with the roster positions.
Yeah, I think the roster positions are really going to be interesting to watch. We discussed it at the running back a couple weeks ago, and we have tight ends coming up here too, which will be an interesting conversation what they're going to do there moving forward. But I do think Streeter is going to beat out Holmes if he's healthy going into camp, because like you said, he was clearly ahead of him at the time of his injury last year at camp, and I really thought he was going to take that spot. It was open, and luckily for Holmes, the injury happened and Streeter was, put on the injured list. So I do think if healthy, Streeter can build on that, come in and be that wide receiver, because we're not going to need Holmes for his supposed special teams. They have a lot of guys that can fill that role. And I don't even know how Streeter is on special teams or not, but I do think it's the top is set with Benjamin, Jones, Curley. I think that's your main guys. You bring in Streeter as a guy that's a little bit versatile, seems to have some reliable hands. And then, I think, McLeod or maybe a Dupree type of guy, whoever really shakes out down there and shows who can make more plays for this team. I think that's where it's going right now. But with that, a lot of guys are going to shake loose from rosters coming up throughout the summer. I've been telling Bills fans, people were panicking after free agency when the Bills didn't get the guys that everyone wanted them to go get. The market was hot. People were overpaying for receivers. I was totally happy with Brandon Beane staying put. This isn't the year to overspend. That's going to be down the road next year. There's going to be names that hit the market. So I'm not really worried there. So I was telling people, kind of pump the brakes. Then the draft came and went. Didn't get the wide receivers people were looking for, but I still said, there's still ways to acquire talent. There's some talent out there. There's going to be guys that shake loose. Brad, I'm going to throw this to you here, man. Do you see anyone sitting on any rosters right now out there, or even currently free agents? I know Dez and Macklin are out there that the Bills could bring in that it could really make an impact that would be worth bringing in a guy and maybe pushing one of those young guys out and not being able to develop one of those guys. What are your thoughts there? The mute's not sticking here. I don't know what happened. Let me toss that to you. Oh, there we go.
As far as guys, sorry about that. I don't know what's going on with this thing. But as far as guys and other rosters go, you would probably have to look at teams who have not only depth, but teams who have brought in rookies to compete with that type of depth. So you're kind of looking at maybe like a guy like who could get cut, like Terrence Williams from the Cowboys. Maybe get something out of him. The Broncos drafted 2 receivers, so maybe if you're looking past Emmanuel Sanders and Marius Thomas, if they want to keep Deshaun Hamilton and Cortland Sutton on the roster, are they going to cut a player? Maybe even the Niners, they brought in 3 rookies, I think, to compete for like their 5th spot. So maybe they're getting rid of 1 or 2 of those guys. So I think you have to look at teams who have some depth and some competition at the back end of the roster. I would think that a guy like Terrence Williams or maybe even Cole Beasley, if you add in Allen Hurns, and then you add in Michael Gallup and Cedric Wilson, who they drafted, I don't think all 3 of the mainstays are gonna make the roster. What was the second part of the question?
And then there's guys that are sitting on the market now, like Macklin. Either of those guys, you think, or any of the guys that are out there?
I think you would get something out of Dez, but I wouldn't add that to the locker room. On the field, I think that you get something out of Dez. I think that he could be a guy who could probably teach Kelvin Benjamin some things. Despite him being a little bit limited athletically, later in his career, he did have, that play style that Kelvin Benjamin probably wants to emulate. He had a ton of success with it. He had a 3-year stretch where I think he was over 10 touchdowns all 3 seasons. Kelvin Benjamin could probably learn from that. And he could probably use something on the field as a number 2 guy across from Kelvin Benjamin. And he's another guy who could probably still win 50-50 balls if Josh Allen is your QB. You want to guard that big frame, but I don't think that you want to add his dynamic into the locker room. I don't think you want to add his dynamic into the young receivers that they have and even probably push one of them off the roster.
Nate, I'm going to kick that same exact question over to that 2-part question. What are your thoughts on guys that might shake free, if you have any guys in mind that you're keeping on an eye on rosters throughout the summer, and then the guys that are out there now that you think can make an impact, like Brad was saying?
Yeah, I mean, apparently Terrence was driving. Who did he get blamed for? It was another Baylor wide receiver blamed him for driving his car and crashing it, but it really wasn't him. It was a really good story. It was on ESPN. It was great. But Terrence Williams, maybe he shakes loose. I think that was a good name to watch. There's some names over in New York as well. I thought it was interesting. Brandon Marshall just signing up in Seattle maybe makes one of their fringe guys who, then again, they didn't really have a ton in the first place after moving Curse last year. The Jets have an interesting wide receiver room. Maybe one of those guys at the top shakes free as well. I don't know. There isn't any one guy on an NFL roster that sticks out. I totally agree with Brad about Dez's demeanor. I don't like his sideline demeanor. I don't think that would mesh well with what they've got. I think he's very outspoken player. They don't necessarily have that in the team, but I don't necessarily think he's a leader. So you don't necessarily want the outspoken guys to not be leaders. If you're going to be outspoken, you're going to be talking, you sort of want them to be a leader and leader by example. I don't see that as Dez. So can he help them at the wide receiver position? I think absolutely. I think Dez would come in here and be your number one. And I think he'd be a better option than Kelvin Benjamin is. But I just don't think, and I think you get a very motivated Dez Bryant. That's why, because I think he's got a lot of people that he's going to prove wrong. And quite honestly, I think Dez is getting sort of an unfair shake out in the free agent market. And I think that he does have some left in the tank. I think he's going to sign on with the team before it's all said and done. And I think he does a lot of having a good season. I just don't think it's going to be here in Buffalo. Sure. I think maybe the guy that makes more sense because they've already shown interest is Jeremy Maclin. Maybe he's right before training camp. Or after training camp, a lot of these guys, might want to catch on. A lot of these veteran guys might want to catch on after camp to try to skip camp and sort of get through some of the hard days of training camp. So that wouldn't shock me because he brings that speed element and he brings that relationship element with LaShawn McCoy, and I'm sure McCoy will be in the coaches and Brandon Beane's ear if they're thin at the wide receiver position and Zay Jones can't be healthy going into the preseason.
Yeah, I agree pretty much with both you guys said. When the Dez conversation for Buffalo started coming up, I didn't love the fit as far as personality goes. I was told that he's just kind of passionate and that is what it is. But I also don't think, I think the free agent stuff goes two ways, right? So a guy has to want to sign and play for your team, and you have to have the desire. We did hear from Brandon Beane that said, he would look into it, that they were looking at Dez. But I don't know that the desire was there from either side necessarily to come in, but I definitely don't think that it was with Dez. I don't think Dez, to me, seems like the guy that wants to come up to Western New York and play with a team that doesn't even have an established quarterback and has a quarterback battle going in. I don't think if
I do think, though, if he had no interest, which he turned down the Ravens because it wasn't the right amount of money or the right fit or whatever it was. So he's shown to turn down teams. It's just going to be whether would he turn the Bills down? At this point, I don't know.
I think that some of the lack of news that we're hearing from him, I don't know. This is just my gut feeling is coming from his camp of telling teams he's just not interested. He might wait it out. He might be gambling on himself, waiting for a guy to go down in training camp, whatever it is, waiting for that right situation because he's looking for a 1-year deal, 1-year prove-it deal. And if you're a guy looking for a 1-year prove-it deal, I don't think that the Bills is a very good situation to go try and prove it. Because the offense is not going to be great and you're not going to put up the stats that prove that you deserve to stay in this league. So if you're betting on yourself, I don't think the Bills is the best place to do it. But maybe in the end, when everything shakes out and the market's totally dry, he has no other opportunity, and say one of these guys goes down in training camp and we just need a wide receiver, that's where I could see a guy like Dez. Maclin, I think that train's left. Personally, I don't know that there's much left in the tank. I don't know that he's better than Curley at this point. I think I'd rather just keep Curley on the roster than bring in a Maclin and see what Zay can develop into, here in year 2. So I don't know that I love either of those guys out there, but I am going to be interested to see how rosters shake out because I really think that is a good spot where the Bills can find talent. And also, Bills fans need to remember, we traded Sammy Watkins a year ago in the middle of the summer. So those types of moves can still also happen throughout training camp summer when guys just say, hey, you know what? We're a preseason game into this. This guy doesn't fit. We're not going to – he's not long term.
Or so, you can't even put out that maybe a young guy in a training camp shows out and a team can get rid of or get out from underneath a veteran contract to go with a guy who's on a rookie contract. And I look right over in Atlanta, too, because obviously they drafted Calvin Ridley, so they're going to have a busy wide receiver. Maybe, Mohamed Sanu, a guy like that becomes available because of what Ridley shows in training camp, and maybe they're not willing to pay a second wide receiver when Jordy Nelson's maybe interested in getting some bigger money, considering what Sammy Watkins got this offseason, which I just want to point out is ridiculous that he got that kind of money, considering his time on the field, what he did when he's been on the field, and the fact that they've got a pretty damn good receiver, a guy who I think is better than him on that roster already. So very interesting move by the Chiefs, but I love Patrick Mahomes. He's going to be surrounded by great receivers, unlike this rookie quarterback. Hopefully by year 2, like Mahomes, hopefully, Josh Allen will get an opportunity to sit for a full season. And then next year when they've got all that room to really put some elite weapons around Allen, similarly to like what Kansas City did this year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And It looks like for some reason Brad is stuck on mute again. I was going to see what he's got coming up here for content, but I think we're going to have to. Oh, here he is, Brad. You keep coming on mute on my screen here, but I wanted to see what do you got coming up for content? Where can these guys follow you? Things like that here before we sign off.
So the Twitter page is at Brad Kelly 17. That's KELLY17. I'm a fellow Irishman, just like the two of you. We spelled the traditional way. There's no EY at the end. But as far as content goes, I have the series of receivers coming out. I'm working on a piece about the top wide receiver duos in the NFL. We're working on a piece about Marvin Jones and Keenan Allen as prospects at Cal and why the NFL was lower on them than they should have been. And we're working on a piece about Dak Prescott's season last year, and I think why it needs to be contextualized and why there wasn't as big of a regression as the casual fan might think. So I have a lot coming out. A lot's in the works. Nothing's, everything's unfinished. Everything's in the queue, as they say.
Yep.
But as far as the follow page goes, it's at Brad Kelly 17.
Awesome, man. Hey, we appreciate you joining us to discuss wide receivers, and I'd love to have you back sometime throughout training camp as this roster starts to shake out and discuss this position further.
Definitely, man. Anytime, and I think that their receivers group is interesting, and I think that the interest is only gonna increase as we find out what they do with the roster and the back end of the roster, and maybe a guy that they bring in. I think that it's a position that is probably going to be one of the most have the most dynamic aspects to it because of the unknown and the uncertain. So should be fun.
Cool, man. We appreciate it. And Nate, what do you got coming up here for content, man?
I'm going to the NBA Finals next Wednesday, so I will not be here. Usually I have a piece coming out next week. I'll probably push it out another week. Yeah, I'm super excited because so Aaron, you and I are pretty big NBA fans. I've never been to a regular season NBA game. I've only been to a preseason game. Two of them, actually. One up in Toronto and one in Syracuse when Melo made his return. So I am going to go to my first real NBA game, and it's going to be a finals game in Game 3. So I'm super excited about that. But, of course, you can check out our work. And I think Eric reposted my piece that I did a few weeks ago about Josh Allen. A couple of reasons why I think he's going to be the starter early. And you can check that up at cover1.net. Just like the rest of our work, Brad's, Aaron's, mine, the whole crew, Russ. And by the way, Russ took a shot at my hair in the group chat today or yesterday, and I don't appreciate that. And I just kind of wanted to give a nice touching of my crispy lettuce because he's clearly jealous he can't grow it like me. So.
Well, actually, I wanted to point it out. I usually wear a hat on the podcast, and I decided to not wear a hat today to show off my hair because of that comment. And I think I have the best hair in the group. But no, that's awesome that you're going to the finals, man. Enjoy it. I've heard it's a great time. I've never been to a playoff NBA game at all, but I hear the atmosphere is just incredible, even if you aren't a fan of the team. So enjoy that experience. As far as the rest of the content you can see here, if you're watching live, there is a ton of content right now up at cover1.net. This one right here, this Watch Jordan Bills Jordan Poyer highlights was just awesome because I think we forget how good he actually played this past year. So go check that out because while we're talking about this offense and there isn't a ton of things to be excited about of this offense, when you go and watch the highlights of the defense last year, you remember, hey, this team still has, while they might be average, they still have some things to get excited about. The development of a young secondary, Jordan Poyer's rise to being a guy that nobody knew about when he signed to being a guy that's right on the cusp of being a Pro Bowl safety. So there's content there. Like Nate said, his reasons why Josh Allen's going to start, a bunch of stuff. We're coming out with stuff all the time. So stay tuned. You can get notifications pushed to your computer, or like we said earlier, grab the app on iOS or Android. You can go and get all the push notifications whenever we're dropping content. So I think next week's tight ends. So that's going to be an interesting conversation. I can't wait to dive into that. And if you haven't listened to the past podcast, if this is your first time joining us, make sure you go back. We're right now we're taking the time during OTAs where there isn't a lot to talk about and going through each position. So we started with running backs. We've done offensive line. We've done wide receivers now. We did the quarterback is where we started, but so we've already broken those down. So you can go back and find all those and do that while you're running or however you decide to torture yourself during the week. Do that and then listen to our podcast and get caught up, because next week we're going to tight ends and then we're jumping straight into the defense, which is going to be a really fun time to talk about some of the depth there. So if this is your first time, go follow us on iTunes, wherever you get your podcast, subscribe, like, all that stuff, and give us a nice review over there, because we keep doing this for you, the fans, and we appreciate everyone listening and can't wait to catch up with you on the next one, guys. Thanks.